To start off with a 19mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then take the wheel off. If your wheel is stuck on like this one, go ahead and put on a lug nut for safety and then use a rubber mallet and tap it from the backside, but always hit the tire, not the rim. You don't want to damage the rim. Remove your lug nut and take the wheel off. The first thing I would technically do is remove this bracket off the strut. Mine is already broken, so I don't have to worry about that, but if yours isn't, 13mm bolt should free this up. Next, take off these 2 nuts with a 21mm socket. That's going to free up the knuckle off the strut so we can pull it forward. And before we go too far, let's remove the axle nut with a 36mm socket. And you want to make sure it pushes through the hub, so I'm going to put the axle nut back on, make it flush with the end of the axle, and give it a couple taps with a hammer. Perfect. One last thing before the knuckle comes off, I'm going to disconnect the tie rod end, 18mm nut. Take a hammer right here on the knuckle, that'll break the tie rod end free. Perfect, remove that. And going back to these bolts, hammer them out. If they don't want to come out, do the same thing. Put the nut back on, flush with the end of the bolt. Now try again. That's one. Looks like they have some splined areas here on this side, so that basically makes them kind of stuck in there. Let's do the same to this lower one, but make sure you don't hit your ABS sensor. Now the knuckle's going to want to come down. Now, as your knuckle comes down, you're going to have to try to push the axle through. Perfect. And now we have direct access to our lower ball joint nut. Now with an 18mm socket, remove this nut. And what I'm going to have to do now, put it back on, and I'm going to bring the knuckle back. So I'll put the axle through. I'm going to attach it to the top of the strut. Start in my 2 bolts. I'm not going to tighten them or anything, I just want them to be here. Now I'll take my pickle fork and hammer, try to separate this ball joint stud from the knuckle. Alright, this came out. That can swing to the side. Now you'll need a cutoff wheel of some sort, so you can cut an X in all 3 of these rivets, and then an air chisel so we can drive them off completely and remove this ball joint. Now try and remove these with an air chisel. And that's all 3 of them. Oops. There you have it. Now take your new ball joint, put in the new bolts that came with it, and start on the nuts that came with the bolts. With a 16mm wrench, I'm going to hold the bolt and 16mm socket, snug up the nut. Now let's torque these to 50 foot-pounds. Now take your knuckle, line up the stud of the ball joint with the hole in the knuckle, and start on the nut. Now at this point it's going to be difficult to torque this with the axle being out, because if the axle's out, that means the strut has to be disconnected, and if that's disconnected, the knuckle's all floppy. So what I'm going to do is tighten it with my wrench. The torque is 30 foot-pounds, which basically just means make it as tight as you can with a wrench, which is exactly what I'm going to do. That's good. And now make sure the slot for the cotter pin lines up. To do that, you always want it tighten, not loosen. Perfect, right there. Now let's get the cotter pin in. Put your cotter pin through. Bend it over to lock it down, but make sure it is not hitting the axle. That's perfect right there. Now take these two nuts and put them back on. And of course, if this bolt for you was not broken, you'd want to reattach that as well at this point. Let's snug these up and then torque them to 133 foot-pounds. Let's reattach the tie rod end. Put on your nut, snug it up with your 18mm socket, and then torque it to 18 foot-pounds. Put your axle nut back on, snug it up, and then we'll torque it to 157 foot-pounds. I have a pry bar going through the studs here so that it can hold the hub in place, prevent it from spinning. That's 157 foot-pounds. And now let's get the wheel back on. Reinstall your wheel. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds.